Navigating the media dumpster fire surrounding this coronavirus epidemic is a challenge. Clickbait websites scream that the sky is falling, while incompetent governments run around doing something. The truth itself has been left at the side of the road waiting for the next bus out of town. What a depressing state of affairs. When will we start demanding integrity and accountability from those who style themselves as watchmen on the wall? We're supposed to be Christians, while some of us seem to be more interested in foolish theories and clickbait lies that scratch their itching ears. And while our attention is elsewhere, greater threats grow. Welcome to the ShockCast. I'm John Little, recording on a chilly Tainan evening on Saturday, February 1st, 2020. Before going on, hit the subscribe button and click that bell to receive a notification when the next ShockCast happens. Also, subscribe to the Shock Letter and receive my articles in your inbox at theshockletter.com. You can also find my posts on Facebook and Twitter. I have 2 books that you can read for free, for now, and they're called When Jacob Returns and Ezekiel's Fire. And believe it or not, there are ways to keep the Shock Letter from going to the spam folder by following certain easy instructions. You can find links for all of that below. Now let's get back to our main story. The Wuhan coronavirus, truth versus the Clickbait Kabuki theater. Oh, special note. Yahoo, AT&T, Bell South, and SBC Global have been blocking the Shock Letter. Please click the spam settings link below and follow the easy instructions to make sure that the Shock Letter reaches your inbox. And of course, you can find it also at theshockletter.com/spamsettings.html. Okay, now where were we? Oh yes. While we have been obsessed with this Wuhan coronavirus, greater problems are growing in other parts of the world. But a plague of locusts in Africa just doesn't have the clickbait power that a nasty virus has. Big trouble is beginning in Egypt. Turkey just laid claim to the eastern Mediterranean. The Palestinians are going to war over the latest peace plan. The EU just took a big step towards falling apart. Iran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium grows quickly. India became number 10 in the list of countries that persecute Christians. And Democrats are doing their best to destroy the American political system. But when 259 people die of a nasty cold in China, we go nuts. And yes, this Wuhan coronavirus is just a nasty version of the common cold. Everyone keeps talking about the coronavirus this and coronavirus that without thinking about one important fact. The common cold is a coronavirus. In fact, the common cold is the coronavirus. It is second only to the rhinovirus for causing the common cold, and a cold is probably the most common of all coronavirus infections. We all get hit with it, or a rhinovirus, at least once a year. In fact, I'm suffering a bit of that right now, and Mrs. Little has it worse. That's right. Mrs. Little has coronavirus. Run for the hills, guys. Did you see what I just did there? I left out an important piece of grammar. Yes, my wife has a coronavirus, but not the coronavirus. That has everyone freaked out. By dropping the use of a or the, I can say that I'm telling the truth while whipping up some extra clicks and hysteria for my website. By the way, my darling dearest probably has the more common rhinovirus, but it's more fun to assume that she has the dreaded and most dreadful coronavirus. But before talking about hoaxes and hysteria, let's talk some truth. Most of you want to hear more about that instead of all my blather about morality and ethics. So let's talk facts and truth before getting into the blather. First of all, what is a coronavirus? Remember that Latin is a foundation of the developed world. In law and science, names and categories are Latin. And the name of this Wuhan coronavirus is Novel Coronavirus 2019 nCoV. It is a beta coronavirus of the family Coronaviridae. And we use corona as a prefix because, under the microscope, it looks like it has a kind of halo or corona. Oh, and the word novel or novel, that's just Latin for new. Aside from the common cold, you might recognize these other coronaviruses. SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome. SARS is also a beta coronavirus that started in the Guangdong province of China with bats. The bats gave the virus to the feline masked palm civet, and the Chinese got it by capturing and eating wild civet cats. There were only just over 8,000 cases of SARS, but the 10% death rate had lots of people spooked. And here in Taiwan, the largest group of people to die from this virus were the frontline health workers, doctors and nurses. I don't remember everyone freaking out over SARS, but I was in Israel at the time and focused on the Middle East. When the Palestinians are blowing up buses down the street, you tend to ignore hysterical media reports from elsewhere. Then there's MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, yet another beta coronavirus. This one came out of Saudi Arabia, from camels. This one was bad, killing about half of everyone who got it. There were about 1,200 cases and almost 450 fatalities. It was bad, but you'll notice that there wasn't a single case of this in Israel. Never drink camel urine. They do that in Saudi Arabia, and you shouldn't. And no, I'm not kidding. Camel urine. Just don't. The irony is that I was in Taiwan when that outbreak started. Since my head was exploding over other issues, I didn't give this coronavirus any attention. Those outbreaks were scary and might be part of the reason why some healthcare professionals are freaking out. They are worried that the death rate for the Wuhan coronavirus will be as big as SARS or MERS. But it hasn't been. At the moment, the fatality rate is just 2.3% in China. Outside of China, the death rate is a big fat zero. That's right, there have been no deaths from this virus. None. Zip, zero outside of China. I know that it's hard to believe anything that the Chinese say, but you can trust what we are seeing outside of China, especially here in Taiwan, where there is no interest in helping China save face. With all the evil that China has done to Taiwan, the Taiwanese are more than ready to report every death from this coronavirus and blame China. But as much as we would like to do so, we can't. No one in Taiwan has died from the Wuhan coronavirus, and we've had 10 cases so far, and Taiwan is currently tracking 1,400 people who might have come in contact with an infected person. But that's small compared to the 7,515 people that came to Taiwan from just Wuhan for Chinese New Year. Think about that for a moment. Taiwan has just 10 cases of the Wuhan coronavirus after more than 7,500 people came to Taiwan from Wuhan. And the only two people to contact this virus in Taiwan were the spouses of those who got the virus in Wuhan. In Taiwan, you need to be married to someone to get the virus. Get it? Got it? Does that maybe tell you that this virus isn't quite as catastrophic as some people would like you to believe? Right. But I don't want to get to the Clickbait Kabuki theater just yet. Let's get into more of the details about this virus. At this moment in time, we have almost 12,000 cases of the Wuhan coronavirus and just 259 fatalities. That's a little over a 2% fatality rate. All of the fatalities and the vast majority of the infections are in China, and every province in China has at least one case. But there might be a little problem with those numbers. First of all, to actually identify someone as having this Wuhan coronavirus, you need a special testing kit. Without it, you can't really be sure that the person actually has this virus. Yes, there are some telltale signs like lesions in the lungs, but you still can't be sure until you have the kit. And Chinese doctors have been reluctant to label someone as having the virus without a positive test. More than that, some doctors are reluctant to give tests to those without strong symptoms. There are only so many of these kits, and everyone with a cough wants to get tested. This means that there might be a far larger number of infected cases than what we are seeing. Outside of China, we've noticed that some infections have symptoms that are extremely weak or non-existent. I'm not sure if we should call them supercarriers yet, Those often have airplanes. But there are probably quite a few people who are running around spreading this virus without knowing that they have it. Then that's a good thing. Why? We know that the fatality rate right now, that's pretty clear, 259 people. So if there is a higher rate of infection at this fatality rate, it means that this virus is even less dangerous than we thought. You really do not want a high fatality rate for this virus, and I am pleased to see that we aren't getting one. So whenever you see headlines proclaiming that 100,000 people have this virus, that's good, really good. You actually want to see that from an epidemiological standpoint. No one wants anyone to be sick, but we also want the fatality rate to be as low as possible. Now, who is actually dying from this virus? The weak. The elderly and those with serious pre-existing conditions are the ones who are dying from this disease. Those who are middle-aged and younger seem to be the ones who survive. Survivors haven't been enjoying themselves, but they are getting through it. For those of you looking for a rational expert analysis of this virus, I highly recommend this YouTube channel, MedCram, Medical Lectures Explained Clearly. And you can just do a search for MedCram videos or just MedCram on YouTube and you'll find it. They do an excellent job of explaining medical issues in a measured, rational manner, and their series on the Wuhan coronavirus is absolutely excellent. They get it, and you will too if you watch their videos. The series that you want to watch is called Coronavirus Epidemic Symptoms, Treatment, Updates, and Spread. I haven't watched all of the videos in that series, just the most recent ones. But what I've heard sounds completely accurate. And authentic, not only just accurate, but authentic and not hysterical. Just good facts and sound analysis. And you really want that. Oh, and this video also says a lot with a sense of humor. This next one really does that, and trust me, you need a sense of humor. It's titled, Deadly Chinese Coronavirus Spreads to the U.S. How Did it Happen? That's from Chris Chappell of America Uncovered. Oh, and Chris Chappell forgot to mention that the Canadian lab was researching Ebola, but I'll talk about all that a little later, so carry on. Unfortunately, we're seeing lots of grim and alarming footage coming out of China, along with people claiming that this coronavirus is everywhere. Take the following video as an example. I included, and you'll see the link for it below. That video is chock full of fear and terror. It's an excellent example of how hysteria gets started. And it's completely understandable that these clips will race around the internet, increasing the level of panic that people feel. And it's hard to be rational in the face of such strong emotion. People in China are genuinely scared, but that doesn't mean that you need to be. Remember that these clips and images are slices of time without context. Yes, they are real, but it's impossible to tell if what we are seeing is the Wuhan coronavirus or something else. We don't know if these ambulances are transporting someone with influenza or some other affliction that would cause them to lose consciousness. The doctors and nurses don't know either, and they're the ones who are the most likely to get this virus next. It is natural for them to be scared. The same goes for the average person filming these events. Now that this coronavirus has hit the headlines in China, any cough or fever is going to be perceived as the Wuhan coronavirus. It won't matter that it's more likely the flu. It will not matter that you might just have a bad case of bronchitis, and that is not gunfire in the background. It's just the start of the new year. Every business that opens will often light off a whole bunch of firecrackers to start everything out. Moving on. Continuing on. To the average Chinese, every sneeze will be the dreaded Wuhan coronavirus in their fevered imagination. To add insult to injury, those with money in China are undoubtedly bribing their way into hospital wards, while the average Chinese must patiently wait their turn for a hospital bed. The rich clog the system with unnecessary demands while the poor get scraps that the wealthy don't consume. That's how China works, and it's disgusting. So please be careful about videos like this that tug at the heartstrings. They're real, but they are not the whole picture. And for your own emotional well-being, you really need to make sure that you understand the full context of what is happening. And without that big picture view, fear sets in. Then getting the average person to stop being afraid is next to impossible. But you are not the average person. You are a child of God with the Holy Spirit. You are destined for heaven when this life ends, so you have absolutely no reason to fear anything. More importantly, God will not let anything touch you if it is not in His will. So if you are afraid, it is a sign that you have some work to do in your spiritual life. We all get afraid of one thing or another. I was deeply worried for my wife when she had an operation to remove a possibly cancerous tumor. I love my wife, so I couldn't help myself. So I really understand any fear that you might have. A little might even be useful in getting you to take wise and necessary precautions for a dark future. But you should not be afraid. It's not necessary, and it clouds your judgment. Furthermore, unnecessary fear will damage the reputation of God and your ability to warn others of what is coming. If you are afraid, people will wonder why, since you keep saying that you are a child of the Most High. And then, when you warn others about real dangers, they will ignore your warning since you had been hysterical so much, at least previously, over nothing. One reader made this excellent comment last week. Quote, "Consider this event to be an opportunity to consider what you need to do during a real plague, as in the 4 horsemen. Some pretty big numbers to crunch are available in Revelation. When government and media overreact, people get burned out on clickbait headlines and will scoff at real danger. Let Holy Spirit be your guide." Psalm 91. Oh, and good old-fashioned washing up will help keep you out of a lot of trouble. Francis in New Mexico. Thank you, Francis. Awesome comment. Francis is right. Real danger is coming. Billions will die. Many who survive will wish that they hadn't. And it is our job to do our best to be a beacon of hope and sanity while everyone and everything falls apart. Terrified people need someone who is level-headed and at peace with God to help calm things down. Panic and terror are barriers to addressing problems. And a terrifying situation is a good time to show everyone who God is and what it's like to be a follower of Jesus. That's the biggest context of all, and something that we all need to remember. One more bit of context that's also useful is history, as long as you put it in the right perspective. Unfortunately, some people have been using the wrong perspective when citing the big pandemics that killed millions of people and left the world utterly shattered. We still bear the scars from these outbreaks, so I can understand some of the fear that some people might be suffering from. But there are gigantic differences between this outbreak and those. Let's just take 3 examples of the worst. The Spanish flu. In 1918, the number of people living on our planet was estimated to be 1.8 billion, and the number of infections stood at around 500 million, or close to a third of the world's population, and fatality rates were observed to be between 500 and 100 million people. And the reason for the great disparity is due to the fact that it was 1918 and not 2018. Nevertheless, between 3 and 6% of the world's population died because of this virus. The Wuhan coronavirus is nothing like the Spanish flu. The Black Death. From 1347 to 1353, between 30% and 60% of Europe died from bubonic plague. It was an utterly horrifying moment in time, and it took 2 centuries for Europe to recover from that devastating outbreak. If you want to talk about death on a truly grand scale, you want to look at the Black Death. The Wuhan coronavirus is nothing like the Black Death. The Plague of Justinian. From AD 541 to 542, up to a quarter of the world's population was estimated to have died from this early version of bubonic plague. And this plague kept returning to Europe in 4 more waves over the next 2 centuries. The Wuhan coronavirus is nothing like the plague of Justinian. We could get into cholera, yellow fever, smallpox, typhus, and even more influenza and plague, but I think that you get the picture. History is full of death by disease, and this virus from Wuhan is nothing like those outbreaks. The irony of history is that its course has been guided by these outbreaks. It's doubtful that Islam would have been so successful if the plague hadn't decimated so much of Europe and the Middle East. And Romanized Britons might have been able to fight off the Anglo-Saxon conquest of Britain were it not for the bubonic plague. And we haven't even talked about malaria. Even after massive efforts, more than 400,000 people die every year from malaria in Africa. And before the Jews returned to the land of Israel, malaria was an incredible curse. For those living in Palestine, you were lucky if any of your children survived to adulthood, and those who survived lived miserable lives. Okay, you now have both a modern and historical perspective to this Wuhan coronavirus. You understand that this is not a pandemic that is worthy of panic. In fact, what is probably causing the most damage is our response to this outbreak. The cure might actually be more damaging than the disease. A very smart, astute reader was quick to see this and shared this observation as a part of his comment from a previous article. Quote, "Every complex network structure has inherent resilience and forgives a lot. With one exception, network hubs, big network nodes connected to everyone. If something affects them, everyone will feel the consequences. And I'm afraid that's coming. I really hope I'm completely wrong, or at least that this network will not pass the threshold after which reaction becomes global, nonlinear, and destructive." Close quote from Chris. Great comment, Chris. Thank you. He's absolutely right. Hubei province and its capital, Wuhan, is a huge transit point for China. Shutting down Wuhan makes it difficult for manufacturing and commerce to function smoothly. If Chinese factories don't get vital parts and raw materials, they have to close their doors and lay off workers. Even if their supply chain merely slows down, that will have a direct impact on the Chinese economy. And the Chinese economy is extremely fragile. Before this outbreak, overall debt to GDP for China was horrifying. And there have already been far too many Chinese banks taken over by the government due to default. And since no one can really believe any of China's economic statistics, some are worried that China will implode. How much longer can China impose this quarantine of central China? If Beijing miscalculates and China falls apart, the rest of the world will worry about who is next. The Middle Kingdom has been the world's manufacturer for 40 years. We don't know what will happen when that GDP growth engine goes into reverse. If this goes on too long, will China continue to exist as a unified country? Probably, but China has a long history of revolution. When the average person sees quote-unquote evidence that the quote-unquote mandate of heaven has been withdrawn, warlords rise, peasants riot, and dynasties fall. And the Chinese Communist Party is just another in a long line of dynasties that eventually met their end in a disaster like this. Right now, I doubt that Xi Jinping sleeps very well. We'll see what happens, but we're all in for an interesting ride. Now that we have all of that out of the way, we can now turn our attention to something more important. Lying liars and the lies they lie with. Did you know that the Bible has something to say about this? My go-to passage comes from Paul's closing remarks in his second letter to Timothy. And you might already know the 2 verses that I'm talking about. Quote, "For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but according to their own desires, because they have itching ears, they will heap up for themselves teachers. And they will turn their ears away from the truth and be turned aside to fables." Close quote. 2 Timothy 4, verses 3-4. This is what I'm seeing everywhere in our churches. Itching ears and fables. And when I talk to pastors about their gross distortions of the Bible, I rarely get a thoughtful response. It's either deafening silence or fire and fury. In this age of deception, it is time to forsake itching ears and fun fables. It's time to get back to the truth. But that won't happen if we don't hold our teachers accountable. Every public teacher of the Bible must be held publicly accountable for the mistakes that he makes. Public mistakes require a public rebuke. And no, YouTube videos are not a church service. We are not required to go through the process outlined in 1 Timothy 5, verses 19 and 20. But even Paul is quick to say that elders need to be publicly admonished when they make errors and refuse correction. And if they still won't listen, they need to be condemned and cast out. It's true. That's the Bible. That's the truth. And yes, the truth really is that important. Now, what follows is going to be uncomfortable for a lot of people, but the lies need to stop. Now, they won't stop until you put your foot down and say no more. These men and women are robbing you of your ability to think straight. Readers have written to me in fear over the lies that are spewing out of videos and websites. They are terrified that this Wuhan coronavirus will come to their neighborhoods and kill millions of people that they care about. You know that this is just not true, which means that you can start ignoring those who refuse to stop spreading these lies. And I have some examples for you. Great Game India, Zero Hedge, a site that I still like, Steve Quayle, Doug Hagman, Hal Turner, Brandon Smith of Altmarket, Mike Adams of Natural News, Before It's News, and the mainstream media. The list of lying liars fanning the flames of hysteria is just a snippet from a much bigger list. There's no way that I can talk about all of them, but I can talk about how these people and websites are lying to you and help you avoid the festering manure pile that they have dumped in your path. If you can learn how to identify hoaxes and the liars who create them, you have a good chance of seeing what's really coming before it's too late to do something about it. For those of you who know how such hoaxes proliferate, you can still benefit from what follows. Before we start, here are 3 rules that seem to apply to hoax sites and hoax videos. First of all, it starts with money. The more clicks that a site gets, the higher the ranking and the greater the advertising revenue. And if they're selling books, t-shirts, and precious metals, even better. A well-packaged lie will always get more clicks and money than the unvarnished truth. Second, these hoaxers are almost always narcissists and or some form of psychopath. They get a dopamine rush when their hoax gets attention. Even when they don't make any money from their hoax, they still enjoy capturing the gullible in their schemes. Third, true believers. There really are people with websites and YouTube channels who believe these lies and feel an urgent need to pass them on. They really feel that they are providing a vital public service and sharing these hoaxes. They do this out of concern for your safety, and I think that we can all identify with that motivation. Some of you might even think that I fall into this third category. I don't mind if you do, as long as you truly examine the facts that I bring up. Serious threats really do lie in our future, just not the ones that these hoaxers talk about. But don't worry about me. Worry about the victims. And there's one in particular that I saw recently on Zero Hedge. His name is Dr. Ping Zhao, and the lying liars of the hoax industrial complex have doxed him, claiming that he's the guy responsible for this virus. The picture I have, you can find it on my website, doesn't matter. You'll see it. Dr. Ping has been studying SARS in bats, but lying liars are attempting to smear him and make his life a living hell. And when they doxed him, they didn't say that he was researching SARS. They said coronavirus. They were being technically accurate since SARS is just another coronavirus, but since their intention was to perpetuate this hoax, they didn't want you realizing that SARS was his focus. These people want clicks. They don't care who gets harmed in the process. I'm just glad that Zero Hedge got suspended from Twitter for helping dox and even harm Dr. Ping. They deserve and should be ashamed of how they participated in this. Now, let's turn to one of the most interesting hoaxes spreading around the internet. It comes from a foul, evil, and revolting website called Great Game India. They appear to have created their site to milk as much money as possible from the millions of Indian expats around the world. I've run into websites like this, and they claim to have deep intel, when all that they really have is clever phrases and a complete lack of conscience. The hoax began when the dirtbags at Great Game India claimed that the Wuhan coronavirus was a bioweapon. They said that the virus was stolen from a Canadian BSL-4 laboratory and then weaponized in Wuhan. I first saw the article when it was picked up by Zero Hedge, which is normally a good source of information, but it didn't make sense, so I ignored it, moved on. Unfortunately, too many disagreed and shared it everywhere. Why did I ignore the article? No one would ever try to weaponize a coronavirus. Kids, if you want to make a bioweapon that kills lots of people, choose something other than a coronavirus. Using Ebola, yellow fever, smallpox, or anthrax will get you a nice big population killer, much more quickly than something like a nasty version of the common cold. Unfortunately, people don't listen to reason, and the Great Game India hoax leaked out into Chinese social media, where Mrs. Little, my Mrs. Little, saw it. She has also been on her own crusade against these lies, but you'll never see what she's saying unless you read Chinese. So, let's look more closely at this hoax from Great Game India to see how they pulled it off. And for me, it starts with a well-intentioned reader who shared a YouTube video with me. That video was basically someone reading the Great Game India article. The person reading it was probably impressed by the fact that it showed up on Zero Hedge and had no idea that it was a complete fake. However, by the way, that's the gong, that's the temple next door. However, I did reach out to the person behind this video, telling her twice that it was a fake. She has refused to acknowledge that this is a lie, but since this video turned up in my inbox, I did some digging. I went to the original article, which started out with a rather outrageous lie. Quote, "Last year, a mysterious shipment was caught smuggling coronavirus from Canada." Close quote. By the way, the gong and the drums that you might hear next door is a part of their temple worship service. The demons are awake. Anyway, it wasn't a coronavirus that they had been smuggling. It was Ebola. Powerful lies are made by just changing one word, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I originally didn't know that the first sentence was a lie, but the second sentence included a phrase that had all the hallmarks of deception. Quote, "Subsequent investigation by Great Game India, ... If you had integrity, you would only use that phrase if you had plenty of staff and the funds to do such investigations. Great Game India does not have access to those kinds of funds, and their subsequent investigation was a Google search. That's it. Once I sensed deception in the article, I dug further. I looked up the dastardly villain that Great Game India pointed their finger at and came up with this article, titled "University Severs Ties with Two Researchers Who Were Escorted Out of National Microbiology Lab." That's how I discovered that the first sentence in the article was a complete lie. Dr. Xiangguo Qiu and Keding Chang were not smuggling a coronavirus. They were smuggling Ebola. Now, how can you tell that the dirtbag writer at Great Game India knew this? The Great Game India article does not have a single link to any news about the attempt to smuggle Ebola out of Canada. They wanted you to think that it was coronavirus. And the writer was betting that you would not do your own research. The lying liars at Great Game India were engaged in a classic case of fraud. They took the current hysteria and built a case for even greater hysteria by falsely linking it to a situation in Canada from July that had nothing to do with any coronavirus. And all that they had to do was change just one word. With that change, just one word, other foolish writers have taken this fraud and added more fraud to it. And all that Great Game India needed to do to get this hoax started was, again, change just one word. That's all that these foul and disgusting people at Great Game India had to do. Just change Ebola to coronavirus. Once they did that, their clickbait article would generate a flood of clicks to their site. Whoever is behind Great Game India is a first-class psychopath. Now that this evil article has passed over into the Chinese language social media, it's spreading fast. My wife is seeing versions of it everywhere in Chinese. She's fighting back against this deception, but lies are hard to neutralize once they've taken root in itching ears. Unfortunately, as I mentioned before, Zero has decided to dox poor Dr. Peng Zhao. They've handed out his email address and phone number, and I'm betting that some moron will track down his physical address. If someone harms him in any way, Great Game India and Zero Hedge will ultimately be responsible. Lies kill. It's time to stop the lies. Unfortunately, Steve Quayle, Doug Hagman, and their circle of trust have been leading the charge in perpetuating many of the hoaxes that surround this outbreak. I did a quick perusal of Quayle's website, and I was disgusted by the hysterical lies that I found there. And this isn't the first time that I've caught Steve Quayle and Doug Hagman being involved in a deception. Do you remember V, the guerrilla economist? He's still running around. Do you remember how Quayle and Hagman claimed that they vetted him? That they checked his background? They did not check his background. They didn't care who or what he was as long as he sounded exciting. Do you know who this V really was? His real name is VG Varghese, and his only real expertise was selling televisions. I kid you not, he sold TVs at an electronics store. Unfortunately, the Quayle-Hagman alliance didn't care who VG was when they foisted this psychopath onto their unsuspecting audience. And I know people who were greatly harmed by this V for villain. And when Steve and Doug were confronted, they refused to stop promoting this lie. Quayle and Hagman knew that Varghese was a liar and a cheat, but they still took advantage of trusting Christians. I did a special report on VG Varghese 3 years ago, and you can read it here, titled Special Report VG Varghese, aka V, the Guerrilla Economist, and you can find it below. Steve Quayle and Doug Hagman are directly responsible for their role in all the harm that VG has done, especially since they gave him his big start. Without Steve and Doug, VG would not have been able to do nearly as much damage as he did. Doug lied about what he knew of VG, and both Doug and Steve lied to cover up their involvement with this psychopath. And what will you find when you go to Steve Quayle's site? More and more lies about the Wuhan virus. I'm going to get to some of those lies, but it should be clear to everyone that Steve Quayle and Doug Hagman do not care about the truth. They want to sell gold, books, and advertising space. And if they can get you to donate to their cause, even better. Steve and Doug claimed to be Christian, and too many brothers and sisters believed that they were telling the truth. Far too many still do. Unfortunately, this duo cannot be Christian. Why? Because a Christian would admit to the evil that they have done and seek to fix the damage that they caused. Since Doug and Steve do not care about the pain and suffering that they were responsible for, it is clear that they are not, and may never have been, followers of Christ. But the fact that they claim to be Christian makes it even more important that you avoid them. They are wolves in sheep's clothing, and they will consume you if you give them the chance. One of the first things that I saw a couple days ago on Steve Quayle's site was this lying clickbait title from Hal Turner. Quote, virus update for USA, worst public health disaster in 100 years, close quote. Wait, the worst in 100 years? Worse than the Great Cucumber Massacre of 1983? Oh wait, that's a song. No, Hal Turner is either an idiot, a liar, or both, and I vote for both. Since I've caught him in lie after lie for years, and some of them are stupid. Remember that deliberate exaggeration is also a form of lying, but Hal does more than that. I also caught Hal lying a few days ago on Steve Quayle's webpage where he claimed that 112,000 people were already dead. I couldn't believe that someone would tell such an outrageous whopper. But when it comes to Hal Turner, you can always tell when he's lying, because his lips are moving. There is absolutely no way that 112,000 people are dead from this virus. Not only would we have heard about this, but there would have been pictures of mass graves full of bodies. You cannot get that number of people dying in Hubei province without everyone knowing about it. There's one thing that Hal Turner is depending on, and that is your ignorance. To you, China is some faraway place where anything could happen. Yes, it's far away, but it still follows all the rules of reality that every other country must follow. And when everyone has a cell phone, pictures and video will show up when something really bad happens. If you listen to Hal Turner, you are literally asking for lies. He is a lying liar that cannot be trusted to report on the weather, let alone even events in China. But let's keep perusing Steve Quayle's site. Here's one. Quote, "How viral pandemic benefits the globalist agenda," close quote. That's from Brandon Smith, an anti-Semite who can't think straight. He's grabbed the Great Game India hoax and then added his own globalist agenda hysteria to it. Brandon has never been completely rational, so I've avoided his articles like, well, the plague. But he's plumbing new depths with this one. There's no way that China is playing some globalist game here. It's a real virus, and yes, bats were involved. Bats have a history of carrying all kinds of nasty pathogens, and they were connected to SARS, which is also a coronavirus. Brandon Smith and Steve Quayle are trying to claim that this is a bioweapon. Again, this is just not possible. There are so many more toxic and contagious pathogens out there that you would be a fool to spend any time on a virus family that is responsible for the common cold. Again, the Wuhan coronavirus cannot be a bioweapon. But Steve Quayle likes to use clickbait, even to the point of claiming that it wasn't the Canadian lab that the Chinese got the virus from, but the Russians. Nice one, Steve. Real nice. Looking through more of Steve Quayle's list of news headlines, I see old Mike Adams. I've caught him peddling fake news before. He once tried to claim that a fire at a party was a homosexual event. It happened just a couple miles from where I lived, and Mike's claims were a complete lie. Lots of Taiwanese were outraged by what he said, and he doubled down, moaning over how the Taiwanese were anti-gay because they were upset by his accusations. Mike Adams is pro-homosexual and a purveyor of fake news. If you need proof, just take a look at a couple of titles that Steve Quayle posted. Quote, "Breaking. Coronavirus hits 15% fatality rate, 83% infection rate for those exposed. Lancet publishes early study that points to alarming consequences for humanity." Breaking. Mike Adams and Dave Hodges share the latest facts on the weaponized virus rampaging through China and across international borders. All of that is complete and utter garbage. You might find tidbits of fact behind this hysteria, but it's all a web of exciting lies to get clicks. Mike is trying to sell you something, and that something isn't truth. Unfortunately, there are more hoax sites than those run by Steve Quayle and Doug Hagman. Again, that's not gunfire in the background, it's just good old-fashioned fireworks, the Chinese kind. When it comes to providing a one-stop shop for fake news and lying lies, beforeitsnews.com is probably your go-to place for the most ridiculous lies on the planet. People have been sending me lots of posts from that moronic website. It grieves me to see anyone going there to find information. I just went there to see if there was anything on the front page of that site that was true. And I was more than a little surprised at how bad it was. The garbage there is piled so high that it's hard to see if there's anything of substance. Every crackpot theorist has something stupid to say on beforeitsnews.com. Aliens, flat earthers, space lizards, Satanists, skin color nationalists, and David Icke are all on Before It's News. You can't even trust the headlines that sound reasonable. One thing is absolutely clear to me. If you read stuff on Before It's News, you do not care about the truth. And yes, it really is that simple. We are Christians. We are followers of Christ. Everything that we are should be connected to the truth. We are commanded to love it. We are to hold on to it, no matter what the cost. If you love the stories told by Steve Quayle and Before It's News, you are in rebellion to the whole idea of truth itself. And I know how easy it is for lies to take hold in your mind, even when you know that they are lies. Go ahead and tell yourself that you are immune to the lies. But you're lying to yourself if you do. If you truly love the truth, then you should avoid the liars with their exciting lies. Then there's an example from the mainstream media. It's interesting, and maybe even more clever than the other examples that I've given. Then it's rooted in our own fascination with the incredible and catastrophic. And as the old newspaper saying goes, if it bleeds, it leads. Fluffy the cat will never make the front page headlines because every newspaper editor knows that war, epidemic, violence, mass murder, and every kind of catastrophe is what sells newspapers. That's why bad news will always be sensationalized. Always. And the more mundane truth will be buried where few will ever see it. Here's an example of what I'm talking about from the Associated Press. The title is, Virus Death Toll in China Rises as U.S. Prepares Evacuation. It starts out with hysterical factoids that you don't get any clear rational perspectives on until you get to the very last sentence. Quote, it is not clear how lethal the new coronavirus is, even whether it is as dangerous as the ordinary flu, which kills tens of thousands of people every year in the U.S. alone. Close quote. This is the disgusting truth about the mainstream media and ourselves. If we weren't focused on the sensational to the exclusion of the boring truth, it is doubtful that the mainstream media would get away with foisting lies upon us. All that the media needs to do is to promote hysteria at the top of their articles and bury the truth at the bottom. They've done that so often that we no longer know what the truth is. I am tempted to quote John Swinton from a short speech that he gave about the independent press in response to a fool who proposed a toast to that body of newspapers. Swinton, the #1 journalist of the 1880s, gave a blistering rebuke to the lying liars that made up the independent press of that day. He called all of them, including himself, intellectual prostitutes. You can read more about that in a short piece that I wrote more than 6 years ago, titled Intellectual Prostitutes, and you can find it on omegashock.com. We have been sold into slavery by a media that likes its fame and fortune. The rich men of this world had the money, so the newspapers wrote what the wealthy wanted us to believe. One of my favorite videos on wealthy men who seek our enslavement is titled, JFK to 9/11, Everything is a Rich Man's Trick. YouTube has been taking down that video, but lots of people keep putting it back up. So if that link doesn't work, search for it elsewhere. Francis Richard Connolly is the narrator and writer, and I can confirm that 95% of what he says is true. His comments on religion, on the other hand, are not true. Okay, that's it for this. I could go on, but I have to stop. This article is already way too long, so let me end the same way that I ended my previous 2 articles and videos on this subject. Let's all take a deep breath and calm down. Don't get caught by the morons spreading hysterical theories about how this virus will kill millions and destroy the world. And this is only one of many hysterical topics that people need to step away from. Yes, we are in the last days. One day things will get really bad, and I have been sounding the alarm about some of those things. Ezekiel's fire really is coming, and far too many will die. But if you are driven hither, thither, and yon by every hysterical headline, you will soon be unable to prepare for the truly difficult days ahead. You will also lose all credibility in the eyes of those who might listen to you. Do you want to help your family, friends, and fellow Christians survive the dark days ahead? then start now by being rational and level-headed. Paul said something along the same lines here, quote, "For God hath not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind." Close quote. 2 Timothy 1, verse 7. You cannot help those who need it most if you have discredited yourself. Please start right now to demonstrate that following Christ means being sober, level-headed, sensible, stable, prudent, wise, and unafraid. After all, he that is with us is greater than any microscopic bug. Oh, and please, above all, share the good news of Jesus Christ with everyone. Well, that's it for this ShockCast. A prudent man foreseeth the evil and hideth himself, but the simple pass on and are punished. Proverbs 22:3. If you find any flaw in my reasoning, have a question, or wish to add your own viewpoint, leave a comment on the website. Your input is truly welcome. Again, get the Shock Letter at theshockletter.com and read my books for free. When Jacob Returns and Ezekiel's Fire. They just might save your life.